Hey guys, Greg Benz here with another photography tutorial. In this video, I want to help demystify one of the more frustrating aspects of digital photography, and that is knowing when you've nailed exposure. Finding the right, the proper, the ideal, the perfect exposure is this elusive goal. Whether you're a beginner just trying to figure out what ISO, shutter, and aperture are all about, or whether you're an advanced expert trying to deal with shooting into the sun, complex lighting, and all these other sorts of scenarios. In this video, I want to give you a systematic way to think about how you get the right exposure. Now, I don't want to oversell this idea. I can't give you a magic formula that just spits out the answer, but I want to give you a systematic way to think about the trade-offs that you face in order to find ultimately what is the right exposure for your style of photography and your subject. We'll go through how to find the right exposure before you ever click the shutter button in the camera, how to review that result on the camera, and then how to review the result on the computer, because each of those three phases has different tools and gives you different information in the process. And ultimately, we want to create a closed loop feedback so that you're continuously learning. So if you make mistakes in the field, you learn from the computer, and next time you do it better. And that's part of the process of getting the right exposure, is that learning process. You can develop that experience. In each of these three phases, though, we just have to think about two different questions. In fact, you can probably get away with just one, depending on the style of your photography. Those questions are, have I overexposed my highlights? And have I underexposed my shadows? If we know the answer to these two questions, then we know if we've captured the entire dynamic range of the scene and have all the data we need to post-process. If you can only answer one of these questions or you're trying to work quickly, the highlights is definitely the more important question. Think about a digital camera. When you overexpose your highlights, you very quickly go from a good to better to an excellent image as you get brighter and brighter. So getting brighter exposures is a good thing, but once you overexpose, that quality immediately falls off a cliff. If you overexpose a highlight by just 1/3 of a stop, it will either lose color or completely start to lose detail. And the difference can be absolutely dramatic, even with the most professional cameras at the base ISO. So highlights are very unforgiving. And in addition to that, the highlights in your photograph are the areas where the viewer's eyes are going to go first. They're going to look in those areas, and if there's any problems there, those details are very bright. So any problems are going to be very, very obvious. So highlights are extremely unforgiving. You have to answer the question of whether or not you've captured critical detail in the highlights. The other question with the shadows, you have a lot more flexibility. If your goal is to shoot a single raw exposure, then you can ignore the shadows question. It's not critical. If you're trying to figure out whether or not you might need multiple exposures, as for example, I often do with landscape photography because I blend multiple exposures using luminosity masks, you might use HDR or other tools like that. You need to understand the shadows to figure out whether or not a single raw exposure has captured all of the dynamic range in the scene. If you set your highlights appropriately and the shadows are in range, then a single frame is going to work. If you set your highlights and the shadows are not in range, then you're going to need multiple exposures. And that's how you can think about whether you need 1 shot, 2 shots, or 5 shots to capture your scene, is trying to understand the expanse from highlight to shadow. Now with the shadows, as I mentioned, they're much more forgiving. There's no cliff like the highlights. If you make a mistake in the shadows, the quality never goes from great to bad. It goes from great to okay to mediocre to poor. It just gets progressively worse in the form of getting more and more noisy. Additionally, as that is the shadow part of the image, the eyes aren't naturally drawn to that part of the image. And if you're processing your image correctly, you're not going to over-lighten your shadows. They're going to remain in shadow. And so any noise and other mistakes in the shadows will tend to be harder to detect. So a mistake in the highlights is essentially unforgivable. A mistake in the shadows is pretty tolerable within several stops. So you have a lot of leeway. So again, make sure you nail the highlights. But if you're thinking about multiple exposures, you have to think about the highlights and shadows. And with those two ideas, we're going to walk through 3 different aspects of capture in this video. The first is, how do you know the right settings before you ever click the shutter? The next is, once you've taken the picture, how do you review it on your camera? And then the third is going to be, once you're back home behind the computer, how do you evaluate the work that you've done? How do you learn from it? And if you've shot multiple exposures, maybe in a bracketed sequence where we want to pick the best one, how do you know which exposure is the right one? We'll go through all three of those areas. So first, I'm going to jump behind the camera with you, and we'll try and take a quick photograph of this room just to show you how you would go about setting the initial shutter speed on your camera for the right exposure. Okay guys, so now I'm behind the camera with you looking at the LCD of my Nikon D810. And this is showing us a preview of the room here. By default, it's just giving me a pretty preview, but if I enable the meter by clicking the OK button, now I see the meter, and notice how the image got much darker because it is simulating the exposure that I'm going to get. So make sure the meter is on, and if you click the info button on the D810, you can cycle these different view modes. And so I'm going to go until I have the histogram. The settings for your camera may be a little bit different, but you should have a meter and you should have a live histogram on your LCD. Now, if you're shooting sports or weddings or other situations where you can't use the live view on your camera, then you're going to have to use the meter, and unfortunately, that's a little bit limited. But we'll talk through why, and the additional follow-up steps after you push the shutter button will be very helpful to you if you're just using the meter and looking through the eyepiece. But if you're using the LCD in your camera, you really should be using the histogram. It's the best tool. With that meter on the camera is just trying to tell you what it thinks is the best overall exposure for this scene. But it's not a very helpful number in the sense that it's going to get you very close to the right result, but it doesn't tell you anything about overexposed highlights, and it doesn't tell you anything about underexposed shadows. And the answer it gives you, even if you understand the Ansel Adams zone system and you know how to correct for the meter for your scene, you really don't know what it's doing to the extremes of your photograph. Consider, for example, at ISO 100, the dynamic range of this camera is much greater than if I'm at night shooting at ISO 6400. And so the meter is always going to give me an answer, but it'll never tell me how big is the dynamic range of this camera. So using the meter requires a lot of extra special knowledge and learning. With the histogram, we get a very precise result. And what it's telling us is the histogram is a graphical representation of all the pixels of the image going from the darkest on the left to the brightest on the right. And so in this image, we have a whole lot of shadows. So we see this big bunch on the left, and we have these bright windows. So we see this bunch on the right. Now notice the window on the left is a little bit brighter than the window on the right. So if I make this image darker, we'll start getting this live update. My guess is we'll see a second peak. And there we go. So we have two windows at different brightness values, so we see two different peaks towards the highlights. Now going back to that idea of properly exposing the highlights is the most important thing. We want to find the exposure where the highlights just barely touch the far right hand side, or there's a little bit of a gap. We know if the highlights have not exceeded the right hand side of our histogram, then they are in range. So at 1/20th, I'm starting to really bunch up on the right hand side. At 1/25th, I've got a very clear gap. It's small, you gotta look close, but there's a very clear gap between the right-hand side and the brightest display on the histogram. Now, if we go even one click further, we see that bigger gap. So 1/25th is definitely going to be either the perfect exposure for a single frame in this room or very, very close to the right result. And without clicking the shutter and reviewing the result, we won't know for certain. But we can evaluate the shadows before we move forward to that phase. So let's open up the image, make it brighter, and find the opposite point where the shadows detach from the left-hand side of the histogram. And that will tell us how many stops we would need to lighten the shadows in order to process this image, because it looks very dark, but a properly exposed image with a digital camera should look very dark. The shadows are very recoverable and the highlights are not. So don't expect this to look like the back of your iPhone camera. Expect it to look like kind of a difficult, complicated mess, but it's a proper exposure. So let's open up these shadows and we'll count the number of clicks. Each time I move the shutter, it's 1/3 of a stop. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Looks like I'm cleared. 9 is definitely cleared. I would call that probably 8 clicks of the wheel. So that's 8 times 1/3. That's 2 2/3 stops that I need to lighten the shadows in this image.
Now I know from experience and from the processes that we'll use on the computer in a few moments that two to three stops. So I know from experience that at ISO 100 with the Nikon D810, I can easily move 2 to 3 stops in the shadows and still get a very usable result. The right answer will depend on your camera, but I'll show you when we get behind the computer, how do you evaluate that and how do you know that you have the right exposure. But for this scene, I'm very confident that 1/25th of a second will get all my highlights and leave me enough shadow detail such that a single raw exposure is going to capture everything in this scene. If the contrast in this scene were to expand by 1 or 2 more stops, then I would probably want to shoot multiple exposures if I really cared about the shadows in this image. If I didn't care about the shadows, I wouldn't necessarily need that. And if I was willing to let the highlights and the windows blow out, I wouldn't necessarily need that. But this is the process we use to determine the full range, the full dynamic range in the scene and evaluate it. But it's still not going to tell us if we need to make trade-offs to clip one or the other, exactly where we need to set it. And that's why we want to evaluate the results on the back of our camera and in the computer. So let's jump to my other camera where we'll review a real-world image I took recently to understand how do we evaluate the result that we got.